Hello and welcome to Merlin's Manor. Today I want to compare two games by Reiner Knizia and published by Cosmos Games, My Island and My City. Now, My Island is basically like a sequel to My City as it is modeled after My City. They are both legacy games that play 1 to 4 players, which utilize flipping cards and placing out polyomino tiles down in an effort to fill up your player board and score points in various ways, which in both games is going to change up some throughout the 24-game campaign. They both take place over 8 chapters with 3 games per chapter. My wife and I played both these games 2 players and have played through My City's campaign twice. Since playing at the 2-player count, you can simply use the other 2-player boards and components to play through again. We also plan to play through My Island again at some point as well. Even after all the boards have been played through, you can play one-off games on the legacy side with its own rules. As I go through my thoughts on this game, I'm going to avoid any major spoilers. There is going to come a time when I will vaguely go over some mechanics that will come up later in the game, and while I plan to keep them vague, they could be considered minor spoilers, and so before I go into that segment of the review, I will give a little warning, and it will be timestamped so you can skip to the next segment of the video if you would like to skip over what may be minor spoilers there, if you're particularly adverse to anything being vaguely referenced in the latter part of the game. Now let's talk about the art and components. The components are fairly basic in both of these games, consisting mainly of these cardboard polyomino tiles of various colors and a deck of cards for each game, which will tell you which piece to place as you flip it over. It's going to have a piece on it, just like that and like that. The polyominoes in My City take on this classic Tetris-style shapes where each of the polyomino pieces in My Island consist of these hexagon-type shapes here. And so they're going to form a cluster of 4 or a triangle of 3, and you got or 2, and a line of 3 as well. Both games have stickers that you'll be adding to your boards and pieces. My Island also has some simple cubes that'll come into play mainly to track when you've scored something. And of course you have your player boards with some basic art on them that really just sets up the place for you to build out your city or your island. The components get the job done. They're nothing special, but they do the job. Now let's talk about ease of play. Both of these games are very easy to learn and have a low complexity rating on BGG. The games start out especially basic to keep it simple to jump into and get started, and then the game evolves over time, adding new rules and changing up and sometimes getting rid of old rules as you go. Because of the way the game slowly introduces these changes, it is very easy to continue to add in all of these concepts that slowly make for a deeper game. I would say that My City ends up being the lighter game overall, but it felt like the complexity ramped up a little sooner in My City, whereas My Island had an especially basic feel to it until somewhere around the 5th chapter, about halfway through the game, when the complexity started to ramp up beyond that of My City. Neither of these games are very complex in the rule set, but will provide a puzzly challenge that grows as you progress through the campaign. I would also like to note here that there is quite a bit of disagreement on the forums over how the scoring is intended to be done in later games for My Island, and this has not been settled so far by the designer or publisher as far as I know. My wife and I went with not including any scoring that is not on the round sheet, as this was how things were done in My City, and made the most sense for My Island since you no longer have in front of you the other ways of scoring, and it'd be very difficult to keep track of those things without the sheet including all of those things. Others say that certain things were never directly told to be dropped, and so those things need to be continued to score, even though they're not on the score sheet for the round. This does add a little murkiness for My Island's rules, and so keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and get into the gameplay review now. To start out my gameplay review for these two games, I want to talk about how my wife and I experienced these games. Our first playthrough of My City's campaign took place over 3 days while I was sick, and we played all 24 games in those 3 days. This speaks not only to how easy it was to learn, but also how I was able to focus on the game even while sick, and how fun it was that we just kept playing and playing through the games. Our second playthrough took place a little over a year later, and took place over less than a month, though if you ignore the 3 weeks we didn't play in between Game 3 and Game 4, it really took us less than a week to play through it. My Island similarly took us about 3 weeks to play through. The gameplay is quick, between 20 to 40 minutes with simultaneous play, and you are encouraged to play through a chapter at a time in both of these games, which is 3 games. There were some days when we played through 2 or 3 chapters or more. Each game tweaks the rules slightly or gives you something extra to focus on. And then each chapter throws something completely new at you, changing up the game in a way that keeps you wanting to play the next chapter to see how the game is going to change up. The games both offer a different feel from the get-go, with My City having you placing these Tetris-shaped pieces starting next to a river in the middle of the board here. And then you're not able to cross the river with a single piece, so you have to kind of line them up on the sides. And then you have to try and fit pieces in a way that fits with that winding river towards the center of the board. Whereas My Island has you starting on one of the beach areas and around the perimeter and working your way inward. In My City, you're going to have trees that you are trying to leave open for points while covering up the rocks, spaces, and empty spaces to avoid losing points. And you will also be scoring points based on buildings and soon for surrounding wells. In My Island, you start out by scoring points for houses on the beach and trying to cover up the beach spaces to avoid negative points. And you'll soon be scoring points for making straight trails and other things that are related to the different terrain types that you're going to have. Now, My City ramps up, as I said earlier, in providing a deeper strategy and complexity quicker than My Island does. And even at one point, I felt led to ask if others agreed with the BGG complexity rating, placing My Island as a heavier game than My City. Around halfway through the campaign, though, My Island really starts to ramp up quite a bit in complexity and depth of strategy, and it overtakes My City in this. I'm about to go into some of the ways that My City and My Island introduce some player interaction, and would like to give that warning right now that there are minor spoilers ahead. And so if you, even though I'm going to try to keep things vague, you may want to skip to the next timestamp if you are concerned about those minor spoiler possibilities. Now, both games start to introduce ways where you are interacting with one another as you start to get midway through the campaign. My City focuses on races to achieve certain things first, as well as to travel along this track and claim bonuses first, which I really enjoyed that aspect of the game. It provided just enough competition in the midst of the game to add something significant to the way that you played the game, being mindful of how fast you were progressing towards those goals compared to your opponent. My Island adds interaction via an area majority type system where as you achieve certain things, then you are able to place out a token and try to claim a bonus by having more tokens by that bonus than your opponent does at the end of the game. Now, while both interactions did make the game more interesting, I preferred My City's races over how My Island introduced their player interaction there. And now we're back to spoiler free, so if you skipped over, you're rejoining us at this time. Like I say, it's a tough call, but overall for the gameplay, I will give a slight nod to My City. I preferred the standard Tetris shapes, as well as the style of player interaction introduced in the later game, and the way you scored points overall in My City. I did appreciate how My Island's complexity increased more towards the end of the game than My City, and both games are very close in this competition. Now let's get into my final thoughts. I give both My City and My Island an 8.5 out of 10. My City is a little simpler overall than My Island, though I will say My City increased in complexity a little faster than My Island. I highly recommend both games, but I give the edge to My City due to the standard Tetris-style shapes, the way it introduces minor player interactions, and the overall scoring opportunities just being a preference to me over My Island's scoring systems. The rules around scoring also seem to be more clearly spelled out for My City as you go, and so can lead to less questioning about what is intended by the designer. Both games overall are still fairly easy to learn to play, and I can highly recommend both of these games if you enjoy Polyomino placement games. My wife and I really enjoyed playing through both of these, and if you enjoy Polyomino placement games, I'm sure you will as well. And there's just the type of games that keep you want to keep coming back over and over again to play that new chapter, to see what's being added and changed up in the rules. And so I hope you've enjoyed this review. It's given you something to think about as to whether these are games for you and which one you might prefer. I know I had to keep things kind of vague to avoid spoilers. If you have any questions, please post those in the comments down below, and I'll try to answer those questions as best I can. I encourage you to check out these videos here to see some more of my videos, and I'll catch you in the next one.